Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today. First thing I want to do, of course, is say that we're thinking about the folks in Florida right now. They're impacted by Hurricane Ian tonight, and hope everyone is as safe as they possibly can be. I'm Denise Duffield, Associate Director of Physicians for Social Responsibility, Los Angeles, and I serve on the steering committee of Back from the Brink, bringing communities together to abolish nuclear weapons. Our discussion today will feature a panel of experts and advocates, including Shailly Gupta, Policy Director for the Poor People's Campaign and Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice, Justin Kwasa, Democracy Program Director for the League of Conservation Voters Education Fund, Mike Latner, Senior Fellow with the Union of Concerned Scientists Center for Science and Democracy, and Kimberly Scott, Executive Director of Georgia Women's Action for New Directions. We have a lot to cover tonight, and we'll try to carve out time for questions after presentation from Mike and then after the roundtable discussion. But first, I'd like to say a few words about Back from the Brink and why we are holding this event. Back from the Brink is a US-based grassroots coalition working on a multi-year campaign to abolish nuclear weapons and to secure a set of common sense US nuclear weapons policies that can help prevent the real and immediate threat of nuclear war. And today, at this very moment, we truly are on the brink of nuclear war. As we sit here tonight, Vladimir Putin is threatening to use a nuclear weapon against Ukraine. The US said that if that happens, there would be severe consequences, increasing the risk of further escalation and additional use of nuclear weapons. But even prior to the Ukraine war, rising global tensions, a new arms race, and the ongoing risk of accidental nuclear war had us closer to nuclear war than at any other time in history. Just last month, the UN Secretary General said, humanity is just one misunderstanding, one miscalculation away from nuclear annihilation. Yet, most of us go about our business as if it's just another day because nuclear war is too horrible to think about, because we think there's nothing we can do about it. And it's true that there's not a whole lot we can do right now to influence the situation in Ukraine where nuclear weapons are concerned. But what we can and must do at this critical time is amplify our call for nuclear abolition so that if we are fortunate enough to survive this crisis without a nuclear war, we never again find ourselves on the brink of losing our lives and everything we hold dear to nuclear weapons. And this is one of the main reasons we're here tonight. Our very ability to do that, to advocate for nuclear abolition and impact US nuclear weapons policy is under threat. Because today we face existential threats to our democracy and to our ability, we the people, to have any meaningful role in the decisions that our government makes. It's happening right before our eyes. We've witnessed blatant voter suppression, restrictions, and disenfranchisement. We've seen deliberate efforts to sow seeds of distrust in the democratic process, an attack on the US Capitol meant to subvert election results, and cruelty and dehumanization that often mark authoritarian states, such as allowing states to mandate forced births and treating immigrants as cargo and political props. To be clear, Back from the Brink is a nonpartisan coalition, and this is a nonpartisan event. Alarms about the erosion of US democracy have been raised by folks of all kinds, nonpartisan groups, liberal groups, conservative groups, historians. And frankly, when it comes to nuclear weapons policy, there's not a whole lot of daylight between Republicans and Democrats in Congress. But all of us here are part of civil society, working to make the world a better, safer place in so many ways. And already the cards are stacked against us with a good deal of power held by moneyed or institutional interests. But it can get worse, much worse. Authoritarian states don't allow for dissent and make it near impossible for civil society or opposition groups to function, to even hold meetings like we're doing right now. And recently, a few folks have asked us, what does democracy have to do with preventing nuclear war? What about other nuclear weapon states like Russia and China? They aren't democracies. Well, no, they're not democracies, nor do they have any true civil society in which people have any meaningful say. So no, we don't have much of a say about how those countries function, treat their citizens, or their nuclear weapons policymaking. But right now, we still have some say in our own country, and we must do all we can to preserve and strengthen that. And that is why defending US democracy is so critical for our efforts to abolish nuclear weapons and prevent nuclear war. US leadership is essential. That's why Back from the Brink calls on the United States to lead a global effort to prevent nuclear war by actively pursuing a verifiable agreement among nuclear-armed states to eliminate their arsenals. It should also be noted that US nuclear weapons policy is an arena that already offers the public limited voice or agency. For example, neither the public nor Congress can weigh in on the Nuclear Posture Review, the document that each administration produces to lay out its nuclear policies. We had hoped that the Biden NPR might at least state that the US renounces the option of using nuclear weapons first. It didn't. And Congress has no say over whether or not to launch a nuclear attack. That remains the US president's sole unchecked authority. It's also decidedly undemocratic that one person or a handful of people worldwide have the power to decide whether millions live or die. In that regard, the very possession of nuclear weapons is tyranny. But we the people aren't shut out of impacting nuclear weapons policy by any means. As of now, we still have a democracy with leaders that we choose to represent our wants and needs. And there's a whole heck of a lot that our representatives can do right now to help prevent nuclear war, including expanding the democratic process around nuclear weapon policy. But decision makers in Washington aren't going to do any such thing if the public, if their constituents don't demand it. And that's where Back from the Brink comes in. Back from the Brink works to build public support and political will for nuclear abolition and policies that reduce the risk of nuclear war by bringing people together in common cause through community organizing. Our mantra is that nuclear weapons are a local issue, and we work to connect that issue to folks' everyday security concerns and community needs. Back from the Brink offers ways for anyone, any individual, organization, or elected official to get involved and make a difference. We help local advocates educate and engage diverse organizations in municipalities in their community while seeking support for the campaign's policy solutions. Advocates then use the local endorsements and resolutions to demonstrate to Congress members that their own constituents want them to take action to prevent nuclear war. Town by town, city by city, county by county, state by state, Back from the Brink is disrupting the deadly complacency about nuclear weapons and replacing it with a call to action. And I'm pleased to let you know that to date, 63 US municipalities and counties, large and small, have voted to adopt Back from the Brink resolutions, including Baltimore, Boston, Bloomington, Chicago, Honolulu, Los Angeles, Minneapolis, Salt Lake City, Tucson, Washington, DC. Just today, St. Paul, Minnesota voted to adopt a Back from the Brink resolutions. And most of these resolutions include support for the UN Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. So all of these US, local, and state governments join hundreds of cities worldwide that support the treaty. Over 320 US, local, and state elected officials and over 400 policy, health, peace, environmental, faith, and justice organizations have also endorsed Back from the Brink. Every endorsement and every resolution matters. Every new activist and every community leader matters. All contribute to a collective force that can become powerful enough to change the nuclear status quo. That's our mission. But we cannot do it if the US is no longer a democracy. Our panelists tonight are going to provide information about just how serious a threat to democracy is, what their organizations are doing about it, and how you can get involved. But before I turn it over, I want to address some concerns we've heard regarding this event, which essentially amount to concern about us not staying in our lane or about intersectionality. We plan to dig deep into this question tonight. The midterms are just 42 days away. So this is not a discussion about abandoning or diluting our efforts to achieve a world free of nuclear weapons. It's about how we do that most effectively and making sure we actually can continue to do this work and make progress. It's a discussion about how and why poverty, environmental health, social justice, human rights, racism have a direct connection to nuclear weapons. How we build solidarity across movements and bring more people and organizations into nuclear disarmament so we become larger, more diverse, and more powerful while helping make progress on other struggles that impact so many people. Now, Back from the Brink released a statement when we became a mobilizing partner for the Poor People's Campaign Moral March on Washington this past June. We said, Back from the Brink recognizes that nuclear weapons are a manifestation of a deeply unjust system in the US and worldwide. We believe that achieving true human security demands a commitment to confronting and dismantling long-standing racial, social, environmental, and economic injustices that threaten the lives and well-being of so many people. Our efforts to eliminate nuclear weapons must, therefore, be part of a large, diverse, intersectional global movement for peace, justice, and democracy. That's what we're trying to do here, folks. So with that, I'm pleased to introduce Sean Meyer, a co-founder and strategic advisor to Back from the Brink, who will introduce Mike Latner and moderate the discussion with our panelists. Time permitting, we hope to have a few minutes after Mike Latner's remarks to get a few questions in, as well as during or towards the end of our roundtable discussion. Thank you.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thanks so much for joining us. And thanks, Denise, for those welcoming remarks and setting the table for our conversation. I'm really looking forward to it. By the way, we have about 175 folks with us as of right now, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Mike Latner. Mike is a former colleague of mine at the Union of Concerned Scientists, and he'll be giving a brief presentation about the state of our nation's democracy and the work we have ahead of us. Mike Latner is a professor of political science at California Polytechnic State University and a senior fellow at the Union of Concerned Scientists Center for Science and Democracy, where he advocates for evidence-based reforms to strengthen democracy. Mike studied electoral system design, political participation, and representation at the University of California at Irvine, and began a lifelong engagement with voting rights advocates and reform movements. And this year he organized a task force report, Achieving Multiracial, Multi-Party Democracy, with several of the nation's top constitutional scholars, election scientists, and grassroots organizers. His most recent academic book is Gerrymandering the States, Partisanship, Race, and the Transformation of American Federalism, co-authored in 2021 and published by Cambridge University Press. So welcome, Mike, and I turn it over to you.
Thanks so much, Sean, and thanks, Denise, for your poignant opening remarks. I have a brief presentation to share that works off of the task force report that Sean mentioned. So I'm going to share my screen quickly, and hopefully everyone can see that okay. I want to start the slideshow. There we go. So this is a task force report that brought together a unique group of constitutional scholars, election law scholars, as well as election scientists like myself, and rarely in the same room with a lot of these groups are actual organizers, professional organizers, grassroots organizers. And the report reflects our findings on both what's wrong with democracy and some practical reforms as to how to get there. And I want to say briefly that the movement is the key to reform. When we look at Poor People's Campaign and other nationwide movements, we are decisively of the opinion that a lot of democracy reform movements tend to put the cart before the horse. That is, you come up with a neat electoral reform or ballot design reform, and then work to implement that. But our expertise demonstrates that it's social movements that build the capacity for structural reform down the road, and we have not done a very good job of doing that. Social movements are a crucial mechanism for negotiating power in any democracy, as those of you who've been involved with organizations are quite aware. We have to go beyond simply shifting coalitions between the existing parties. We've got to integrate the electorate. There are over 80 million people that did not vote in 2020, which was a record turnout year for the United States. And we'll talk about why those people don't vote. But to set the stage briefly, I do want to make very clear just what a precarious situation we are in with regard to the certification of the 2022 election and obviously 2024. There is a concerted effort among right-wing authoritarian groups to take advantage of the uncertainty and the threats and the intimidation that our local election officials and election administrators have been targeted by over the last 2 years since 2020. And these efforts involve both filling polling stations with people who are prepared to challenge ballots, as well as to get elected officials into power who themselves are election deniers. And we have not seen this sort of an attack on the basic infrastructure of our democracy in our lifetimes, certainly within the last few generations. So what can we do about that? Well, we need a movement to counter that. We need movements for all policy organizations, whether they're environmental groups or nuclear proliferation groups or what have you. Anyone that is interested in making policy in a democracy has a direct interest in making sure that we remain a democracy so that we can pursue those interests. And movement organizations drive the sort of democratization that we're looking for. That's true in the US, as we have seen it perennially. The story of democratic development in this country is not a linear, upward tick. It's a back and forth process of advancement and then retrenchment. And we are in one of those periods of retrenchment. So when we look at the abolition movement, the suffrage movement, the voting rights movement in the 60s and 70s, we are now experiencing a retrenchment, a reaction to what was the second Reconstruction in American history, the huge advancements that we made in with the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and the incorporation of the 14th Amendment into state constitutions. We're now in the midst of a backlash against that. And so we need a movement to counter that. When we look at why people don't participate, for example, certainly restrictive election laws are a central element of this backlash and this retrenchment, because those election laws are designed to entrench minority governments in power, particularly at the state legislative level, so they can then control the composition of Congress and really upset the balance of power with through federalism. Those are important, but the effects of voter ID laws and late registration deadlines and the like, they have marginal but important effects. But when we look at why people say that they don't vote, certainly voter registration is a big deal, right? About a third of voters worried that they're not registered or that they haven't been correctly registered. But most people just believe that the system is not responsive to them, that parties and politicians don't care about people like them, that it really doesn't matter whether they vote because it doesn't make a difference, they're only one person, or that voting in elections has little to do with the way that decisions are made in this country. This is something that we should be paying more attention to, because we've got to be able to answer these fundamental dislocations between potential voters and elections if we're going to create a movement and achieve the sort of democracy and power that we need to then shift coalitions in a direction that's going to be beneficial for all of us. And that means changing the electorate, right? Getting people to vote. It particularly means targeting low propensity voters in precincts and in the communities that are frankly left behind by both the Democratic and Republican parties in their traditionally data-heavy, micro-targeting mobilization tactics that look to mobilize people that are generally already going to vote. They're high propensity voters. They're people that have a lot of data about them, so they can be used in the micro-targeting tactics that well-funded campaigns typically follow. In order to counter this, we've got to look at the whole electoral cycle and look at where we can build out partnerships. And this is nothing new to the other members of this panel, right? But the real point here is that if you focus particularly on the right side of the cycle here, planning and implementation, training and education by local election administrators and agencies, and updating database, right? Taking a data-centric approach and understanding that if we want to stop the sort of disinformation that's out there and the intimidation that we're going to see, there's no question that we're going to see it at voting precincts in 42 days. And I would add that there's already more than 2,000 people have already voted in the 2022 election, right? North Carolina starts its early voting quite early. And so people are already voting in this election. So we are in it. And we've got to be prepared to help both the community-led organizations that are canvassing the neighborhoods that have potential voters that are often left behind, as well as the election agencies. Anyone on this call who has the basic time and resources and skills to help local election agencies plan and implement and prepare for emergency situations, which we're going to see, to help with training and education, to reach out to local groups and make sure that every group from students to senior citizens are prepared and have the education that they need in order to make sure they're registered to vote, and then contact to make sure that their ballot registrations go through and that there aren't errors that are keeping people off the voting rolls. This is the time to be doing that work right now, because the data is being generated, the ballots are being generated, and if we want a free and fair election, we're going to have to ensure that that information is available to voters and that we're taking care to look for irregularities and to ensure that everyone has a fair opportunity to vote. Those practices extend into early voting and election day operations, and to the tabulation and reporting of votes. There are still over 1,000 counties in the United States that don't even have basic election websites. And obviously those are going to be more rural counties, but certainly to the extent that information doesn't get out in the places where we know we're going to be targeted with attacks, and including the big cities and battleground states. So Atlanta and Detroit and Milwaukee and Philadelphia, we know where these attacks are coming, and we know that that data is going to be very important in order to fight disinformation and to fight uncertainty, because the more uncertainty that you have in an election, the more opportunity there is for actors to attempt to sow doubt into the results and to eventually attempt to overturn the election, either by giving state legislatures the authority to call a failed election or something of that nature. And frankly, the threat of violence is quite real as well, because when people are being sent to election precincts to gum up the system and to create uncertainty, that's going to create conflict with local voters, and we need to protect those local voters. So to summarize quickly, it's our view that every organization that has national infrastructure, that has the communications that we need, needs to become a pro-democracy movement at this time, starting now and at least through 2022 and through 2024. We know what attacks are coming, and we know that what we need to do to counter these attacks, and it's going to take individual volunteer time from people with the capacity and the commitment to ensure free and fair elections for everyone. So announcing organizational responsibility as a pro-democracy organization, investing resources and capacity to community-led long-term organizations. We don't need to reinvent the wheel. There are plenty of local community organizations that need our support, and we can support those groups with our time and our capacity. We can create and sustain open electoral systems. Again, providing the information, being able to help community-led organizations, election organizations to publicize data and to ensure that that we're seeing where turnout is low and where it's high, and we can address those inequalities, because we want, again, everyone to have an opportunity for a free and fair election. There are plenty of long-term solutions as well that I'm happy to discuss if we have time for that in the roundtable. But frankly, right now we're looking at a month and a half of really go time, and it is important that everyone do their share. So I'll leave it at that.
Well, thanks very much, Mike. It looks like we do have a couple of questions, and we certainly have time. We're sort of ahead of schedule, which is terrific. I mean, one of the things that I was hoping to ask you, Mike, is, could you talk a little bit about previously democratic states or countries that really did see a serious erosion of democracy? I think a lot of us just have a hard time believing that this is real, that we really are in this backsliding moment where the foundation of our democracy is at stake. And maybe, speak to the experience of other democratic states that have that are no longer democratic states, if you could.
Yeah, absolutely. The pattern here is a pretty well-defined pattern, particularly with the rise of right-wing authoritarianism and then the sort of collapse of the democratic process that often led those parties into power. So when we look at Turkey and Hungary and Poland, for those of you that are watching the news, Italy just elected its most far-right prime minister since Mussolini. Even Sweden, which I typically hold up as a model of consociational democracy. The second largest party there is now a right-wing populist party. So this is a global phenomenon that we're seeing. And in the instances where these coalitions have effectively been cordoned off from power, it is the responsibility of party elites. It is and party elites within the coalition. So in this case, the Republican Party elites disavowing and working to keep those people out of power, as well as every other coalition. And so basically what you see when this sort of catastrophe is averted is that there's a coalition that cordons off the anti-democratic forces. And that's a coalition of the right and the left. It's clearly something that we have not seen in this country. And this is one of the reasons why I'm so concerned. On January 7th, it looked like that coalition was going to come together, right? If you listen to the words of Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, if you listen to the words of Mitch McConnell, blame was clearly placed at the foot of the former president for the attempted insurrection. And it looked as though that coalition was going to hold, but it clearly didn't, right? McCarthy was brought to heel and was back down in Mar-a-Lago, within a month of the insurrection. And 147 members of our Congress voted to challenge the electoral rules. And so we do not have a pro-democracy movement in this country. We don't even have enough of a pro-democracy movement right now to pass the Electoral Count Act. I mean, it looks like that may actually come through. So we'll have some provision to protect the certification of the Electoral College vote. But note that leaves in place all the other discriminatory measures that have been put into place over the last several years. Measures that are directly targeting voters of color and voting and targeting voters in battleground states that are designed to just take off enough votes at the margin in order to entrench these minority governments and state legislatures in power. And so it is, this is as concerned as I've ever been, and my opinion is widely shared by political and social scientists around the world.
So I'm just going to ask one follow-up, and then we'll do a couple of questions. So Denise, made reference to civil society in general in her remarks in civil society and authoritarian states. Could you sort of speak to that element of like the diminished capacity and influence of civil society in states that have really become more authoritarian? Because that obviously cuts right to what we're talking about tonight, that the ability for us to do our job, whether it's nuclear abolition or climate, racial justice, etc.
Right. Yeah, it's a great question. And it is one of the things that makes me optimistic that this is actually not only possible, but feasible. Because when we look across, we use comparative data and look across the world's regimes, there's a very tight correlation between how inclusive a party system is internationally in terms of all sorts of sort of democratic open measures, whether or not women have a free and fair chance to run and be elected to office, whether or not members of racial or ethnic minorities within a country have a free and fair opportunity to be represented and to represent. And all of that's a function of civil society. The participation, level of participation in non-state sanctioned political organizations and political association is key to an inclusive party system. And what's somewhat ironic about the US is that we actually score quite well on civil society, right? I mean, we are a nation of joiners, as de Tocqueville famously said. The problem is that even our civil society capacity tends to reflect the inequalities of our society. That is, it is primarily a more affluent, whiter, more educated folks that are involved in a lot of civil society organizations. And unless those organizations are directly engaged in targeting those who are left behind in our society, that's going to be the key. And so we've got to take our organizational muscle, frankly, and aim it towards opening up our system to those who are left behind. And we do have the capacity, right? We've got the organizational strength. The question is whether we have the political will.
Thanks, Mike. So there are a couple of questions in that have been submitted, and a few of them are sort of related, and I'm going to try to sort of group them together. Basically, the broad question is about alternative forms of voting, ranked choice voting.
Sure.
The one reference was to fusion voting, which I have to admit I don't actually know what that means. It might be, and maybe you could just sort of speak to the broad question of, isn't a part of this sort of empowerment really about changing, and moving away from this winner take all sort of model that we operate, most states operate under.
Yeah. I mean, that's absolutely fair. And I've been very engaged in the reform community for a long time. One of the things that came out of this task force report, and here, frankly, there are probably other members of this panel that are better able to speak to the importance of this than I, because I'm not a social movement expert. The goal needs to be to open up our party system. And so there are structural institutional reforms. Ranked choice voting is catching fire right now. Fused balloting, where you allow party organizations to support multiple candidates, and you could allow more than one party to support a candidate. There's some East Coast states that allow this. I think it's a great idea. The evidence on ranked choice voting is rather mixed. It's frankly a pretty incremental reform, and it's something that I don't support putting a lot of organizational energy into. But all of these things are, I think, very attractive to donors often, and to funding organizations, because they're a new shiny object. But what really needs to happen is we've got to build support and political strength for reform. Once we do that, then yes, let's have a debate over what sort of institutional reforms we need to open up our party system, and certainly moving towards a more proportional system that ensures representation for ethnic and racial minorities, and opens up the gates for women and others to run, compared to our more restrictive party system, is very important. But first, we've got to organize.
Thanks, Mike. Let's see. Mike Martin asked the question about, you made reference to the electoral reform bill. Could you just sort of speak to that? Mike asked, if that passes, how helpful will that be for ensuring that the electoral college system is not subverted by state legislatures?
I'm of mixed minds, right? I mean, it's a crucial piece of legislation. There's no question that we need to fix the Electoral Count Act. What the Trump administration attempted to do was specifically use the vagaries within the existing procedural rules to try to get Vice President Mike Pence to overturn the election. And that's a result of vagaries that are in that law. So I'm fairly optimistic. Even Mitch McConnell signaled that he's supportive of letting the bill get a vote. So I think that will happen, and it's necessary, because we've got to remove the political discretion of state legislatures to claim that there's a failed election and then to send their own electors. This law deals with that, but if that's all we get out of democracy reform in this country, we're screwed, because it's literally the lowest hanging fruit that we can get, and it only deals with the certification of the electoral college votes.
So a couple of other questions. We'll maybe do two more, and then we'll move to our panel. And I'm going to try to group these two together, but maybe that won't be fair to you, Mike. So one of the questions was, how do we educate and influence the grassroots and disseminate good information when sort of traditional avenues of dissemination, the media and social media, which is sort of often untrustworthy. How do we get good information out to people? And then this is really a separate question. So, what do you tell people that say that they don't feel like the major parties care about them and that their vote doesn't make a difference? Those really are two separate questions. So forgive me, but maybe take the first one.
So the first question I think I'll leave to the panel, because frankly, they're much better experts on that than I am. The second question, I guess the short answer is that you shouldn't try to tell them that the parties do care, because they don't. I think we should be honest with voters and let them know that if they want to make a difference, they've got to vote and they've got to become part of the process, not to acquiesce to the major parties, but to challenge them. And that's what movements always require of the major parties, and they will react, and that's the only way that progress has ever worked in this country.
Thanks. So one last question, and then we're gonna move on. The question is the national popular vote effort making any progress, and how likely is that movement to be successful?
Yeah, that's a good question as well. So the National Popular Vote movement is a way of getting around the procedures of the Electoral College. It's a kind of interstate commerce clause that triggers once there are 270 electoral votes worth of states that sign on to this legislation. Their votes would automatically go to whoever wins the popular vote. So you don't have to have a constitutional convention. It began, more than a decade ago, I believe. And I think about 190 or 200 electoral votes worth of states have already signed on, including a number of big states and a couple of mid-sized states. So as you can imagine, as we get closer to 270, it gets more difficult, right? Because that means that we got to get some smaller states that are, advantaged by the Electoral College. And it really just depends on who controls those state legislatures and whether those state legislatures are open to a national popular vote. So again, I hate to sound redundant, but it comes back to the local, it comes back to working within your state to transform those state legislatures.
Well, thank you so much, Mike. That was really terrific, and certainly we're looking forward to further comments from you during the discussion. So we're going to now move to our roundtable discussion, and I'm very pleased to. I'll introduce all of our panelists at one time, and thank you so much for being here, and for all of you for sharing your wisdom and perspectives. So I'd first like to introduce Shailly Barnes. Shailly is the policy director for the Poor People's Campaign, a national call for moral revival, and the Kairos Center for Religions, Rights, and Social Justice. Shailly has a background in law, economics, and human rights, and has spent nearly 20 years working with and for poor and dispossessed communities on the issues of poverty, systemic racism, ecological devastation, and militarism. She has authored numerous reports and policy briefings and worked closely with policy experts, impacted people, and lawmakers. Welcome, Shailly. I'd like to now introduce Kimberly Scott. Kimberly Scott is a native Atlantan and has a bachelor's in chemical engineering from Vanderbilt University in Nashville. She has a wide range of environmental and climate justice experiences along with grassroots organizing. Kim is the current executive director of Georgia WAND, Women's Action for New Directions, an environmental and social justice not-for-profit organization based in Atlanta. She's also the CEO of In-Town Realty Development, which is a real estate and development firm. Kim's previous work experiences include over 18 years in the private engineering, consulting, and government sectors, including being an engineer and project director with the City of Atlanta. Kim is a community leader and a champion for changes in inequities that impact the environment, housing, and community issues. And her goals for Georgia WAND include deepening their relationships with current and potential partners while strengthening and growing the work of the organization by advocating for environmental, social justice, and racial equity for underserved and Black and brown folks around clean air, clean energy, clean water, land, nuclear, and against eminent domain. So welcome, Kim. I'd next like to introduce Justin Kwasa. Justin is also a former colleague of mine at the Union of Concerned Scientists. Justin is the Voting Rights Program Director at the League of Conservation Voters Education Fund. He's responsible for coordination and amplification of the federal and state voting rights advocacy done by LCV under its Democracy for All program. He also has experience advocating against nuclear proliferation while he was at UCS. Justin joined LCV in 2019 after his time at the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights, where he was the national coordinator for its voting rights project during the 2018 midterms. He started out in voting rights about a decade ago, helping to run a GOTV campaign office in Milwaukee during the 2012 presidential election. So welcome, Justin. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to direct my first question to Kim. And Kim, I'd like to sort of ask you about really the highly consequential work that Georgia Wand and so many other groups did in Georgia leading up to the 2020 elections. And we know how important that work was. And so I'd love for you to just sort of take a few minutes to talk about what did that work look like, and why did Georgia Wand, a group that works on a range of issues, environmental, social, and racial justice, and nuclear issues, get involved? And then we'll open this up to all the panelists.
Okay. Well, first of all, let me say to Denise and to Sean and to Michael, thank you for having us here. The back from the Brink program. I love the work that you're doing, and thank you so much for having us. Again, Georgia Wand is an environmental social justice nonprofit, and we typically focus on nuclear harm reduction, whether it's from nuclear energy, from the electricity and power production plant from Georgia Power in Burke County, which is in Southeast Georgia, or the nuclear weapons facilities along the Savannah River site, and that's also in Southeast Georgia. While we got involved, I must take just a point of personal privilege to thank my board and my predecessors that started kind of steering Georgia Wand to looking at the environmental and climate social injustices that we would see on a day-to-day basis around our work. And so we were able to start focusing on that, but also focusing on the elected representation that impact not only the communities that we serve, but also the policies and initiatives that go along with it. We were very intentional about making sure that we have staff that live, work, and play in the communities that we serve, and that we educated and informed them about the elected representation and things that were happening in Georgia around our work and just impacting our everyday lives. And so in 2020, Georgia Wand advanced one of our social justice initiatives with volunteers and hired canvassers. We worked with Pro Georgia to conduct get out to vote phone banks and door-to-door campaigning. And through that canvassing initiative, what we continued working with our underserved communities, whether it was in Burke County and Southeast Georgia, or within Atlanta's collection of neighborhoods in NPUV, which is, it stands for Neighborhood Planning Unit, but it's in Southeast Atlanta. We were urging all people to get out to vote. But in urging them to get out to vote, we were also educating them on what that meant and how that impacted them. And, when we talk about energy burden communities, we talk about people not being able to pay their water bills or their utility bills, their power bills. It's important that they know that there is representation, elected representation that, controls that. And so with that, the results from, our canvassing, our get out to vote showed up, and it really was a contribution to systemic change that we saw. We did phone banking, we did text messaging, we did almost 20,000 of that. And we know that over 65%, we polled over 65% of the people that we actually touched actually voted in the 2020 elections. They also came out and voted in the 2021 runoffs. And so we were excited about that. And we used that as a model for now the midterms that are coming up in November. And we're very excited about that election that hits closer to home for us with our work, because we have the Public Service Commission, and that election is going to be a special election. But that's a 5-member board that controls our utilities, whether it's power, gas, or telecom. And so people were unaware that this was a statewide election and it was going to be on the ballot. And so there was a lawsuit that was made by some of our capacity building partners, but now it's going to be a special election. But we have that, and of course we have some of the other state elections that are coming up. And so we're using that same model for these elections. And we know that with some of the things that we did for the 2020 election, we will continue in the 2021 election, and hopefully we will have the same victory that we had in 2020.
Thanks, Kim. Could you point to, you mentioned before just that, sort of really getting to the people and making the connection to how this matters, why voting matters to them. And, could you point to sort of specific sort of tactics about sort of what really resonated with folks to sort of get them to say, yeah, I really need to do this. I need to really go out and vote or register or what have you.
Yeah, so I will say, since I've been with Georgia One, we've been really good about education and informing, whether it's through grassroots efforts, going into the communities, making sure that the communities, making sure our staff and our board look like the communities that we serve. Number one, we're very big on live, work, play. So we actually, all of our staff and our board pretty much live, work, and play in the communities that we serve. That was big for me. And I wanted to make sure that we push that. But also giving them the resources, letting them know, like I said, the Public Service Commission, it's a 5-member board. It's been around 100 years. And we have frontline communities that we serve that can't pay their power bills. These are elected positions, 6-year terms, and it was going to be on the ballot. Most people didn't even know what it was about. So just getting that information out to them and letting them know that, hey, these are people that we elect. They serve 6-year terms. They have a modest salary. It's a 6-figure salary. And we have people in our communities that are having trouble paying their power bills. They're having trouble paying their gas bills. Now we need to look at the people that have been elected, to make sure that it's equitable and make sure that these processes don't continue to impact them, from a negative standpoint. We have also EMCs, those are our electric membership corporations that also service some of our communities that are paying, $30 million in property taxes. Yet the communities that, pay their power bills to these companies are not putting the same type of investment in the communities where they're located. We have migrant workers. We don't have housing that is significant when we talk about, true housing development. And we don't have a pathway for, our residents, our neighbors, our community stakeholders to even make a good salary to be able to pay these bills. So, those are things I think when we bring it home like that and say, look, these people are controlling it. They are holding the puppet strings, and you have an opportunity to change it. We need commissioners that are people focused, that care about the community, and that, won't allow some of the injustices that we continue to see, in our communities continue, going forward. So it's just kind of bringing that home and communicating that, mailers are also important. Having legislative town halls, obviously, but just creating a space where they can talk and we can talk to them and listen to them about, what they're experiencing and what we see the data is showing, especially when we talk about energy burden, but also some of the environmental injustices that we're seeing and exacerbated by climate change. We have to get people in elected representation in here that will help us right some of these wrongs that we've seen in our communities for a long time now.
Wow, thank you. That sounds like just really powerful work. So I'm going to open it up to others, and I wanted to we'll do a go around with this basic question. And again, Denise sort of alluded to this earlier, that so all of you all work on a range of issues, really important issues: climate change, racial and economic justice, protecting the environment, and of course, nuclear weapons. so why, with all those important issues that we're all focused on, why should we be focused on energy, and want that sort of take, energy and resources and capacity and activism away from these other important, fights? And, again, that's sort of the question of like, why, should we stay in our lane? Maybe we'll start with Shailly, and we'll go around and see what folks have to say.
Sure. Thank you, Sean, and everybody. It's been just a really important conversation this evening. From the Poor People's Campaign, from our assessment and our perspective, we've really always connected these issues of political rights and substantive rights, right? Reflecting the fact that our democracy is about much more than elections. Our democracy is about the right to participate in the decisions that affect our everyday lives, just like Kim was saying, whether that's how much we get paid, whether we have a hospital or a fire station in our neighborhood, how much our water and utilities bills are, what kind of resources our schools have, just all of these issues, all the issues we care about and issues we confront every day that converge on the strength of our democracy. Right. And so we've been losing ground on that front for far too long. And the people who are most impacted by that are, as Michael was saying earlier, kind of poor and dispossessed people who have been kind of systematically and deliberately disorganized out of the political process, out of the economy. And so, I think as we all know, there have been these systematic and escalating constraints on our ability to participate in elections. We've had 2 presidential elections without the full protections of the Voting Rights Act. There are laws that are being passed today in states that were formally covered under the Voting Rights Act, that there would never have been, this kind of law passed, a decade ago, right? And so 19 states passed voter suppression laws last year. 39 states are considering nearly 400 restrictive bills in the 2022 session. Just tens of millions of people, would be adversely affected just in their ability to participate in elections, but then millions more would be adversely affected by the policies that are enacted through voter suppression, especially, right, people who are unhoused, unemployed, uninsured, undocumented, again, poor and low income people just across the board. And why? Why would there be all this effort going into suppressing our participation, if not for the power of democracy, if not for the power of having a voice and a stake in these decisions that affect our lives, and the power of being able to decide how our resources are allocated, right? I mean, and so just across the board, it's just, and military spending, I think people ask, like, why are you focusing on this issue? When, just to go back to the question, well, I mean, it kind of just reveals the extent of this insanity, right? We've spent 7.5 more times on nuclear weapons than we did on global vaccine donations. We've spent $21 trillion militarizing our society since 9/11. $21 trillion. That could have, we could have decarbonized our electric grid. We could have created millions of, $15 an hour jobs with benefits. We could have canceled all student debt. We could have expanded the child tax credit for another decade. We could have guaranteed free preschool. We could have provided all the vaccines we needed for the poor countries in the world, and so much more. And so, I mean, that's a reflection of the ground that we've lost on democracy. And so that, I mean, it's time to push back and reclaim that ground. And again, the people who are hurt most by this, who have the most to gain from pushing back, are, the 140 million poor and low income people in this country, among them 80 million eligible voters. Right. And so, the work of the Poor People's Campaign is to activate and engage as many of those voters as we can, not just in the midterms, but in a movement that votes.
You're getting me fired up, Shailly. Justin, you wanna jump in here?
Not really. I mean, between Michael, Shailly, and Kimberly, I mean, I think they said all that really needs to be said. I think I'm just redundant. But I'll speak to it. We have a saying in the environmental space, you can't have a healthy environment without a healthy democracy. And so, pretty much what that means is that, we know that, regardless of wherever you're from, everybody wants clean air to breathe, clean water to drink, healthy communities, non-polluted communities for their families to live in. And despite the fact that everybody wants that, we have a government, we have a political system that doesn't provide that. And the reason for that is because polluters, or whoever you want to call it, are able to pick on the most vulnerable communities that traditionally haven't had a voice in our democracy. So whether it is communities of color, Black communities that literally couldn't vote because of slavery or because of Jim Crow laws or other reasons, whether that's immigrant communities today that many people don't have voices because they're not citizens of this country, or just flat out communities with low income because they don't have the money or the other resources in order to have that voice at the table. Pollution happens, and the pollution that we fight against for groups like League of Conservation Voters happens because people are not engaged in our people have been excluded out of our democracy. And so as a result of that, that is why they are in any situation that they're in today. So as a result of that, that is why we truly do believe that voting, and in a larger sense, democracy, needs to be a core strategy of the environmental movement, because this democracy is the mechanism by which we are going to implement the policies that protect our communities and that protect our planet. And so it has to be a strategy. And no, it's not taking away from the work, but it's actually enhancing the work, because once again, we know that if we live in a democracy where every voice is heard and every voice is respected, we know that the issues that we care about are going to come out on the right way, because it is a reflection of the people and not a reflection of the polluted class that is doing everything in their power in order to take away people's votes so that theirs is the only one left. So no, we don't believe that this is takes away from the work that we're doing, but this actually enhances the work that we're doing. And I think it enhances every other progressive issues that we care about.
Thanks, Justin. I don't think you're redundant at all. That was terrific. And it's just interesting that we have this saying within Back from the Brink about nuclear weapons are a local issue, and so so much of what you all have been talking about is sort of making that connection on all sorts of issues, and Kim gave a very sort of specific sort of example of utility bills and the power of this Public Service Commission, but it's so critical, this message that you all are delivering about sort of making the connections about why the issue is important, and this is why you need to participate in your democracy if you're allowed to. So I just very much appreciate what you just said, Justin. Before we move on to sort of the second round of questions, and then I think we'll have some time to get to some questions from folks who are joining us. I just wanted to see if Mike or Kim had anything they wanted to kind of throw into the mix with this sort of first round of conversation. Okay, I can't see their faces, so I'm going to assume not. Go ahead.
Briefly, that Kim's point about local issues is something that I think we all can identify with, right? And what our research has shown is that the people care deeply about their communities. They just don't make the connection between the conditions of their community and this an abstract world of political power. And so making that connection is the key. Whether it's, I have an example of a group, a Greater Cleveland congregation we work with in Ohio. And there it might be an issue of, maybe the neighborhood pool is supposed to open and it doesn't open. And that affects children, it affects parents, and making that local connection of, well, actually there are elected folks that are responsible for this, and you could have a voice in changing the quality of your neighborhood. That's the kind of key connection. And I'd also just add real quick that Justin's being a little bit too humble right now, because we've been in this space for many years, and we all owe him a great gratitude. He's taught me many things about the dynamics between organizing and reform over the last couple of years, and we're lucky to have him.
I completely agree with that.
Well, I wanted to add one thing to that, if you don't mind. Michael said it earlier, and I wanted to touch on it. Justin kind of mentioned it too. When you're changing the electorate, we're also talking about influencing policies and initiatives by educating our policymakers. And one of the things that we've been working on too, that I think is important when we're educating our lawmakers is, to understand where they are in this political scheme. We have one federal piece of legislation called RECA, is the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act. And when we found out about it, we noticed that Georgia as a state wasn't, part of the initial bill. And they were only focusing on uranium and the New Mexico states. And I said, well, hey, we have communities that are surrounded by radioactive, whether it's, the nuclear energy power plants or the nuclear weapons facilities, in Southeast Georgia, that, we have seen historically where communities have gotten cancer or died from cancer. These workers in these communities need to be named in this bill. And so, just kind of educating our new lawmakers. And then we had Senator John Ossoff that was part of the judicial committee. And we said, hey, we have this bill. We heard about it. We would love to have Georgia included and have some of the byproducts that we've seen that impact our communities, other than uranium. We have plutonium, we have tritium. We would love to get those added, and then get our communities, part of this bill so that they can be compensated. So I think in changing the electorate, we also have to educate the lawmakers on what this means, and also get them, to hopefully put in policies and initiatives that make our communities better as well.
Thanks, Kim. So we're going to shift to, we've got 100, looks like about 150 folks still with us, and we've really sort of promised this to be a forum for how people can get involved. And so this is, we want to really shift to that part of the conversation to really give folks who are with us tonight, sort of ideas about how they might do that, with others or individually. And so what I'd like to do is just sort of do another round with you all, really giving you the floor to each individually sort of talk about what your organizations are doing, in the here and now, in defending democracy, and maybe try to sort of cite sort of specific ways where folks who are supporters of your organization have been getting plugged in or could get plugged in. And maybe we'll just sort of do the same sequence, and I'll start with Shailly.
Yes. So the Pro-Mules campaign, we are, engaging those millions of low income and low propensity voters. Michael, you mentioned that. We did this in the 2020, in the lead up to the 2020 elections. We reached out to, millions of low income and low propensity voters, people who basically hadn't been engaged in the election cycle, past 2 or 3 election cycles, nonpartisan outreach around the issues that really matter. It was bilingual, it was also an ASL, and we just, we had kind of tested this in the sense that, what we were trying to test was the idea that, can you engage low income and low propensity voters around the issues that matter to them? And would that make a difference? We had done research that kind of showed the potential impact this could have. And our results, what we found was that our outreach did make a difference. Overall, there were, we reached out to a couple million voters. We had a, positive impact on that outreach. And them engaging in elections, but overall 50 million poor and low income people voted in 2020. That's a third of the electorate. Like in 45 states, that was at least 20% of the votes that were cast, right? And in a lot of those states, just small upticks in segments of the voting electorate could change the outcome of those elections. So, and as we're preparing now for the midterms, we're reaching out to 5 million poor and low income, low propensity voters around key issues, and in targeted states in the South and Midwest. We've seen, whether it's in Kansas, whether it's around 15, whether it's around rights restoration, we've seen that there are issues that bring people together across partisan divide. And so that's what we're going for. And we're bringing people into, as we say, a movement that votes. This is our response to the assaults on democracy, is, to the rise of white supremacy. Christian nationalism is to bring this electorate, this segment of the electorate together, poor, Black voters, poor white voters, poor Latino, Asian, Native, any and all gender and sexual orientations, wherever you live, 1/3 of the electorate has a bunch of things in common. And we're focused on bringing them together rather than being divided. And so we're training actually hundreds of volunteers, to get involved. We can look up on poorpeoplescampaign.org. You can find your state committee, sign up, and then you'll receive information about how to text bank, hundreds and even thousands of people in a very small amount of time. We've already reached out to, I think, over 500,000 voters. And so we're just steadily making our way through to the 5 million.
And Shailly, could you just sort of speak a little bit more to sort of your chapter affiliate system? Because I think, one of the things that we've been emphasizing within Back from the Brink is, hey, there's this wonderful national organization, the Poor People's Campaign, and in many states, there are these state chapters. I think you call them chapters, and go talk to those folks, go get involved with the Poor People's Campaign. I'm doing some work, here in Western Massachusetts, and I've gotten connected with the wonderful folks here in Massachusetts that are running the Poor People's Campaign. So maybe speak to that just a little bit.
Sure. So we're a national campaign, but we have what we call coordinating committees in 45 states. And so these committees have been, they've gone through some training. They have the kind of diverse, fusion leadership that is characteristic of our campaign at a national level. We replicate that, at a state level. And, the states are taking leadership around this voter engagement drive. There are, I think, 12 or 15 targeted states, but you can volunteer kind of in any state to be one of the text bankers, right? To get trained up. Those targeted state trained up in how to use the voter engagement system, the platform, but and each state may also be contacting its own, will be contacting its own list of people internally. But there are these then kind of 15 states that we're targeting kind of nationally as a national campaign. And so the best way to plug into that is to find your state coordinating committee through our website and get engaged kind of right away.
Yeah, and I would just say thank you, and I would just say that with this broader sort of question of sort of intersectional organizing, we are also really sort of stressing to folks that get to know the folks at the Poor People's Campaign and sort of make those connections and show and act in solidarity with each other. For example, in Boston, the Boston City Council passed a Back from the Brink resolution some time ago, and it was a pretty broad coalition that moved that resolution forward, and it included folks from the Poor People's Campaign. It included folks from the Sierra Club and a number of groups. So it's a real good opportunity to sort of do that relationship building at the local level with your folks. So thank you, Shailly. Justin, you want to talk a little bit about what you all are up to?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think, as everybody can imagine, we have voters in our name, so we're really, really focused on this election, and we really want people to be involved in the election. So, obviously, we're having our programs registering people to vote, making sure they're having their voices heard. But it goes beyond that, and there are ways for folks to be involved, to be civically engaged beyond just voting. Even though obviously voting is number one thing that you need to do. Please do that. But really encouraging people to make a plan to vote. So obviously there's numerous amount of ways that people can have their vote suppressed. So making sure today how, when, and where you're going to vote. Particularly if you can vote early by mail, I think that's ideal. But also if you are going to vote in person, either early or on the day, making sure you have plenty enough time off, making sure you have you know exactly the process that needs to happen in order to make sure that you will have your voices heard. In addition, we really want people, there are millions and millions of people that participate around the country in order to make sure our elections go off safely and securely. And so we're also encouraging people to, if you have the time, to sign up to be a poll worker. That is an extremely important position for so many people to take, and really so many people can have their have positive voting experiences and make sure their voices are heard based off of a supportive voice inside the polling place, guiding them through the election. Also, if you can't spend the whole day, there are also numerous organizations that are providing opportunities to be poll watchers outside the election. And so we know that there are people that are going to try to intimidate folks outside of elections offices. And so being able to count that, track that, and report some of those instances are extremely important as well. And then finally, being able to talk to your friends, families, communities about voting and encouraging 1, 2, 3, or your whole community to go out and vote is extremely important. So being able to counteract any misinformations out there and ensuring that your personal network is informed and ready to vote as well are different activities that we're encouraging people to be civically engaged this fall. But once again, it all starts with making sure you have your voices heard and voting yourself first and foremost.
Thanks, Justin. Kim, do you want to jump in?
Yeah, like I mentioned before, we're going to continue advancing our social justice initiative like we did in 2020 for the presidential election and the Senate runoffs in 2021. But with our capacity building relationships that we have with Pro Georgia, we're doing voter registration. We're also are doing some get out to vote initiatives. Just continue with our legislative town halls and making sure that people are just informed and educated about what's actually happening in their community. And then just some of the work that we're doing, ways that people can find out more about us or get involved. They can go to our website at gawand.org and sign up for our newsletter, because we do a monthly newsletter. Because what we found with our communities is that everyone may not be social media savvy, and they like to read. They like to read the paper. They like to read the newsletter. They may even like to receive some mailers, periodically. So we want to make sure that we're touching them and meet them where they are when it comes to communicating, around not only these elections, but different policies and initiatives, again, that impact not only our work, but every aspect of our quality of life. They can also email us at info@Georgia, spelled out, wand.org, and also become part of our email distribution list so that we can keep them informed of what's going on. But I think it's also important too, some of the things we're working on is that we're doing some capacity building activities with the Georgia conservation voters through our legislative policy director. We wanted to make sure that people understood that they have an opportunity, if they're paying their power bills to these EMCs, they have an opportunity to join. They have an opportunity to get involved and hopefully change some of the, the things that are impacting us day to day. And so GCV was really adamant and start pushing this initiative. And I told them that we wanted to join. So we'll be doing that starting in Burke County in Southeast Georgia. So I'm excited about that. And those are the things, this little steps. But, those are things that, can really be beneficial and impactful, one neighborhood, one community, one EMC at a time, and just telling the neighbors, one of the things we started with our staff, and our staff was like, oh, yeah, I pay my power bill to this EMC. I didn't know that I could join and become a member. Well, as a ratepayer, you are a member. So that's the first thing. But, once you become an officer, then you have a say so in actually how they're governing and how they're, doing their business. And so I thought it was important. We started there, and then they reached out to other neighbors and was like, hey, we pay our bills to Oglethorpe Power. We pay our bills to Planters, or, even people in Fulton County, that are not Georgia Power customers. But knowing that they can get involved, and make a difference just with that small step was important. So we're continuing with capacity building activities like that. And, just making sure that people are aware about the elections, when it's time to early vote, when the absentee ballots are due, and, particularly with the Public Service Commission, this special election. And just on the federal level, anything that we see that impacts Georgia that has been overlooked in DC, we want to make sure that, our DC elected officials know about it and that they can help us moving forward with some of the policy initiatives and policy changes that we would like to see.
Excellent. Thank you, Kim. Mike, do you want to jump in? particular at UCS that
Quickly, I
know
can
about?
just say, do what these groups are doing, right? I mean, that's UCS has a large science network. We've got tens of thousands of scientists and science advocates around the country, and what we're encouraging them to do is to plug in to community organizations that are doing the work on the ground. It's really, I think, important to distinguish between traditional voter mobilization efforts and what we're hearing here today, right? We're talking about building relationships with people, long-term relationships. You're building a reservoir of political support, and that's how you build power. This is not asking people to show up one time for one election. This is about building relationships, and maybe you're not able or not inclined. If you're not a public-facing person, there's still a lot of contribution that you can make. So, to Justin's point about becoming a poll worker or a poll watcher, you can also help out your local election administration. I mean, these offices are often strapped for resources. They're doing the best that they can with what little they're giving, and they can use resources and data skills and capacity to publicize and to work through the sort of procedural problems with making sure that everyone has a chance to vote. In Ohio in 2020, again, our partners on the ground there were able to work with the county election administration officials. We were monitoring the ballot applications. So in Ohio, you have to apply to vote by mail, and that's a separate process. And every time you have a separate process, you're introducing the potential for error. And indeed, we saw really high spikes in those applications being rejected. And our partners on the ground were able to work with the election administrators, get the names of those who had had their ballots rejected, and they were able to recontact 8,000 people to make sure that their ballot applications went through and were processed, and they didn't have to vote in the middle of a pandemic. So, working with your local election administrators in all sorts of ways is also a fruitful way to make sure that the process is free and fair. And ultimately, we want to try to do away with the sort of inequalities that exacerbate the political inequalities that we see in participation.
Thanks, Mike. So let's see, we have 10 minutes left. There's not many questions that have come in. There were a couple of questions that had a decidedly partisan bent to it, so I think I need to kind of pass on them. There was one question that maybe we'll spend a couple of minutes on, and then we'll go to wrap up. The question was really sort of what's motivating the extreme right to do the things that they're doing to undermine our democracy? I know that's a huge question, and then maybe it's not fair to sort of put this on you all. But it's a good and interesting question. Is it about power? Is it about money? So if any of you had any sort of quick thoughts on that, and then maybe we can turn it back over to Denise for some wrap up remarks.
I don't think it is that complicated. I think that anytime a powerful coalition can't win through democratic means, they're going to win through whatever means they can. And we're in yes, there are a lot of causes, right? So you've got a tremendous amount of capital that wants to promote very unpopular policies, and so they can't depend on democracy to win. You've got demographic changes happening in the country, and there are things that make people susceptible to this sort of disinformation and the sort of polarization that we're seeing. And this is nothing new in America, right? I think that we want to get away from language of we've got to fix democracy or rebuild it. This has just always been part of the democratic process in this country. If we want representation, we've got to fight for it. And we're in a period of entrenchment. We've got to reverse that.
Yeah, I just wanted to add also, I think we have to be mindful that when we talk about the extreme right, there are different motivations depending on who we're talking about. It's not a monolithic group. The people who, the public figures, who have experienced a lot of personal fame and wealth, through some of this thinking, they have different motivations than other people who may be involved for other reasons. And I think it's important to maintain those to understand that the diversity within that, within this broader, this broad, they're broad numbers. There are people also who, can be won over to a different kind of politics that doesn't rely on fear and hate, to secure whatever needs to be secured. That, I think believing in, the goodness of people is also some of what it means to expand and protect our democracy. And every expansion, so we talk about a third Reconstruction moment now, but the first Reconstruction and the second Reconstruction, they brought people into the political process that had been formally excluded from it, right? And so, and that meant millions and millions of poor and dispossessed, building that multiracial electorate, and bringing along, millions of other, poor white people who had also not been able to take advantage of that political system. And I think there are lessons there for our current moment, to carry forward in our context. And so I just wanted to bring that as well into the conversation.
Thank you, Shailly. So I think we've got about 5 or 7 minutes left, and I know Denise, we're going to turn it back over to you, right, for some closing remarks. Thank you all.
Hey, thank you, Sean, and thank you so much to our amazing panelists, Shailly, Mike, Justin, Kim. You guys are awesome, and very inspiring words. I know I'm definitely planning to do all I can do in the next 42 days, just 42 days here at this incredibly pivotal moment in our country's history, and maybe in human history when nuclear weapons are concerned. In addition to some of the initiatives we just heard about, Back from the Brink is pleased to announce that we will hold an action hour on Wednesday, October 12th at 7 p.m. So if this is all new to you and you're nervous and you want to do it with like-minded folks, you can come join us. And we'll very likely be holding them on subsequent Wednesdays in October as well. And we'll be on Zoom together, and while we're taking action together to defend our democracy. We'll send out an email to all participants of this webinar with more information about this and other efforts you can get involved in. And we urge you to do all that you can to ask your family, your friends, and your colleagues to do so as well. And please join our efforts to prevent nuclear war. This truly is an all hands on deck moment. And there are many ways to get involved. You can ask your Congress member to co-sponsor HRES 1185, which is a Back from the Brink resolution. You can ask organizations or your local and state elected officials to endorse our policy solutions. You can launch a resolution effort in your own community. You can join us at our monthly local organizing meetups or get advice from folks, who've been doing this for a while. So check out our website, preventnuclearwar.org, and sign up for our list. Each of us has a role to play. Again, I want to thank our amazing panelists and speakers and wish you all a good evening.
Good night, everyone. Thank you. Thank you, Denise. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.